So today, what I'm doing is I'm continuing the Black History series, and I'm at part 7. And this session is really going to be about Black progress and focusing on the issue of institutional racism. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this section is because there's so much misinformation out there, and I hear a lot of people constantly repeating what really is coming from troll farms, saying that, well, black people were better off in segregation, that we didn't have certain problems and certain things didn't occur during segregation, and we had more of this and we had more of that and all those things. But if we actually analyze the reality, this is just a myth, and this misinformation that's being directed at us. And we have many black people who repeat the misinformation. Uh, so what I want to do is I want to correct this. Also, I think it's really important to look at and understand what has been called or characterized as the so-called Great Replacement Theory. And what is the Great Replacement Theory? It's a theory put forth by white supremacists that actually says that America is the white man's country, that it was founded by white people for white people. And as a consequence, they're saying that now you have other groups that have come into the country, including black people, and that they are now trying to replace the white man, and that policies from the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, and fair housing, all the regime of civil rights laws that were passed, that those things they claim give privilege to black people and discriminate against white people. And as a result, they have been working to systematically eliminate the civil rights laws and the voting rights and the protections that were afforded black people as a result of their marches and demonstrations and struggles during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And so the system currently under this administration, the Trump administration, has the black community under attack. And as a consequence, over the last 9 months or so, there are about 350,000 black women have lost their jobs under the auspices of elimination of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. Um, these losses occurred in both the federal government and in the private sector, because much of the private sector has been pressured to implement anti-DEI policies by the current administration. So it's not just an assault in terms of the government. It is also the larger community, the business community, is pressured by the government to lay and participate this assault on black people and the rights of black people. And so when we began to look at this, we already see an increase in black poverty. We see an increase in other kinds of pathologies in the black community. This almost an immediate response to some of the things that are going on in terms of the policies of the current administration. And so in terms of looking at this and understanding this concept of a great replacement theory, it's really an effort to dismantle the progress that was made through the civil rights movement of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It's also very significant to recognize that those policies and procedures and that whole regime of law was put into place because prior to that, under Jim Crow segregation, there was massive lynching of black people. There were black communities, towns, cities that were attacked by YT mobs and burned and looted. No one ever was brought to justice. There was physical suppression of black voters so that blacks would be attacked if they voted, if they tried to participate in the electoral process. And so there was an attack on the ability of black people to make any genuine progress and black people were segregated and marginalized and pushed kind of to the back burner. And they were also economically exploited during this particular period of time. And so a consensus of a majority of Americans, including YT people and black people and others, decided that these civil rights laws were just and that they were the right thing to do in order to correct the past discrimination that had taken place, the past racial attacks on the black community, and to be able to try to fix these things. They passed these civil rights laws. And there was a major shift in policy that took place with Brown versus Board of Education. Actually eliminated the Jim Crow segregation Supreme Court ruling that authorized Jim Crow segregation, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. It was reversed in Brown versus Board of Education. And then the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act. We look at all of these things and we see a new regime of laws that come into place that were implemented by the Dormant Commerce Clause, because there had been civil rights laws right after the Civil War, but the Supreme Court ultimately said, well, they're unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment doesn't allow you to do this. But in the new period of time, this Supreme Court, or the Supreme Court, not the current one, but the one when the civil rights laws were passed, looked at this and they were able to utilize the Dormant Commerce Clause to be able to say that as part of the regulation of interstate commerce, we can enforce non-discrimination. And so that's what they did. Even though those rules and laws were available back after the Civil War, there was no will to implement those by the Republican Party at that time, who actually compromised the rights of black people in 1877 with the so-called Great Compromise, or what they call the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, and federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and the K organization and YT supremacy groups were allowed to attack and do whatever they wanted to black people. And this whole regime resulted in the elimination of any blacks from Congress after 1901. No black was elected to Congress until about 28 years later. And this was part of systematic exclusion of black people from voting, by poll taxes, by literacy tests, by just use of terror tactics, and by gerrymandering election districts, and all types of techniques and schemes were used to disenfranchise black people, to stop black people from being able to vote, to have any type of power whatsoever. And during this particular time, lynching went to an all-time high. You had atrocities take place like the Wilmington massacre in Wilmington, North Carolina. You had the Rosewood massacre in Rosewood, Florida. You had the Tulsa massacre in the so-called Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So when we began to look at and understand the actual history of what was happening, we can actually see the basis and foundation of why a certain portion of the YT community in good conscience recognized the need for these civil rights laws, and they joined in coalition with black people to implement policies and procedures and rules through the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, and a number of other laws that were developed in order to grant black people access to society. Now, these policies didn't actually grant any real preferential treatment for black people. They only created fairness to allow black people access where in the past, black people were excluded simply because of the color of their skin. So it didn't mean that an unqualified black person gets a job just because they're black. That was not part of what occurred. And it's not part of what has been occurring. That's a myth. The reality is that black people were excluded in the past. And because they were excluded based on their race, there were policies put in place that allowed employers and everyone else to be able to choose black people. And very often without retaliation from YT supremacists. Because there was a point in time where if a company tried to pick fairly and hire black people, they would get ostracized by the YT community. They'd get boycotted. They would get attacked. Their families were in danger and everything else because of the virility of racism was that strong within the YT community. And so this anti-black effort was made illegal as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and numerous other laws that were put in place that help deal with environmental protections and a wide range of other areas of life within the black community, within the community of America overall, but that benefited the black community. So what I want to do is I want to drill down, I want to look at some of this stuff and look at just a number of really different specific areas that I think are very critical for us to understand if we're going to really understand institutional racism. There are many people who are arguing, well, we're in a post-racial society. Race doesn't matter. You even have some young black people saying, oh, well, I'm not affected. Race has never affected me. It's never. But they don't really have the history. They don't really have the understanding. And in many cases, their sense of reality is so out of touch with the rest of the world that they're living in a bubble. And I'll give you an example of that. I was in a conversation the other day, and there was a young man who was saying, well, I live in the suburbs, and, I used to live in Baltimore and now live in the suburbs. And, it's a lot of black people that live in the suburbs with me, and we're all doing fine, and everything is so great. And, and it was saying all of these things as though we live in a post-racial society. He acknowledged some issues of race, but for the most part, his view was such that it really was out of touch with even many of the people who live in the very poverty-stricken areas of Baltimore. When you actually go around the country, what you'll find is that there is a significant population of black people that are suffering in poverty, that are in segregated communities, that are marginalized, and they still feel the vestiges of racial segregation. So even though there are some black people that are doing better, and many of those black people don't really see the pain and suffering of what other blacks are going through, and they live in a bubble. So, when the YT folks sticks the microphone in front of them, they say, oh, well, I haven't experienced racism. I don't know about racism. But in reality, it's there. And it's there amongst more black people than they even understand because they are out of touch with the overall community. They're not really in the hood, so to speak. And so it's important to be able to put these things in place and understand. And I want to look at something that Martin Luther King said, because the question was raised to him about legislation and all those things. And someone asked him, they said, well, look, you can't legislate love. You can't, integrate your way in and force YT people to love you and all that. And of course, that wasn't Martin Luther King's goal at all. And they completely misunderstood Martin Luther King with the question that they raised. So when they said, well, you can't legislate love, Martin Luther King's response was that, well, you can't legislate love, but you can stay murder. And that laws can protect me from being lynched. And I think that's pretty important too. So, we're not expecting laws to make somebody love us or care about us or even accept us. We just need laws in place to protect us so that we cannot become victimized because we live in a civil society. When we want to live in a civil society, and in the past, we've been subjected to all kinds of atrocities and terror attacks and all those kinds of things. And the question becomes, would we continue to allow anything like that to happen? And right now, there are about 46.9 million black people in America, and this is a new day. It's highly unlikely that any type of large-scale attacks would be successful on the black community. It just won't work. And no matter how much this president attempts to bring the military and do all of these things, the only thing that would result would be the complete and total destruction of America. And the whole way of life of Americans. So the things that people want to try to preserve, this administration is threatening its very existence, because black people, we've been in this country and have helped build this country. And we are just as much a part of this country as anybody else, and have just as many rights and privileges. And to try to deny us these things and take away our rights, we've never actually achieved equity in this country. So the whole ideal that we live in a post-racial society is a pure fantasy. It's a made-up lie by evil and wicked men who are promoting an evil and wicked lie. You can see that the average YT family has between 13 and 17 times the accumulated wealth of the average black family. You can look at a number of different factors. For example, today, as many as 20.7% of the black community lives below poverty. That's over 10 million black people living below poverty out of about 46.9 million black people. In addition to that, the unemployment rate today is about 7.5% in the black community, but while it's about 4.3% overall, and the YT unemployment rate is even below that. If you look at the average black household income is about $56,000 a year, the average YT household income is about $90,000 a year. So we see falling black home ownership. We see all kinds of major indicators of resegregation. We see indicators that indicate that the black community is slipping backwards. About three black people are about 2.3 times likely to or have a higher have a 2.3 times higher incidence of poverty than they do for their YT counterparts. And so when you begin to look at what's happening, we're slipping backwards, and it's a bunch of policies now that are being put in place to try to rapidly accelerate the destruction of the infrastructure of black progress by eroding affirmative action, by eliminating diversity, equity, and inclusion, by eliminating the anti-discrimination clauses in federal government contracts. And in addition to that, you've got problems in terms of the educational system. So black people, there's a 20 to 40-point academic achievement gap in reading, math, and science, which has a major outsized negative impact upon black progress. The average black family, in terms of looking at where we're going in the future, that we are in troubled waters. We're in troubled times right now, and there is an open attack on the black community. And so it's really important for us to recognize and understand where we are in terms of reality. And we have we got some folks in our community that we're under an attack, an identity attack. There's an effort to destabilize the identity of the black community, to make black people have a split identity, and try to destroy black people's self-concept, to disconnect us from the African continent, to disconnect us from the some 700 million other black people of African descent in the African diaspora, as well as the 1.3 billion black people of Africans in sub-Saharan black Africa. So in terms of our connection to each other, there's an effort to try to undermine and destroy that. And there are a bunch of people who just unwittingly are involved in it because they don't really understand. They are generally people that are miseducated. They are generally people that it's what they're listening to. They're listening to misinformation sources. And so this is one of the reasons why I think it's so critical for us to really, really examine what's happening. So I want to talk about several different areas and talking about institutional racism. The first one I want to talk about is housing. So when we look at the situation, we can look historically that in 1910, there were about 10% of black families own their home in 1910. And so, in terms of now, this number may have been higher at some point before, but around 10% owned their homes in 1910. By 1940, about 23% of black people owned their homes. And so by 1940, and most of this occurred after the New Deal was established under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and after the work began of the National Council of Negro Women under the Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. And so there was a movement that took place that helped push black people into getting home, becoming homeowners. There was also a major effort to for black people that had served in World War I and that then subsequently served in World War II to be able to get access to housing. So if we look at, and it's important, I think, to understand what happened, to understand what institutional racism is and how it came about, particularly in talking about housing right now. So in 1933, when the New Deal was passed, there was something called the Federal Housing Administration established. And there was also something called the Home Ownership Loan Corporation. These two entities were put in place to try to stabilize home ownership and build a middle class in America and help people become home owners. And of course, this program, the way that it was set up, it initially was designed with anti-discrimination clauses so that that black people could participate in it. But most states had segregation laws in place and that were upheld because of the U.S. Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson established Jim Crow segregation, made it illegal for states to have segregation. And so under this regime and under this situation, they developed housing maps all across the country. Now, they've developed about 200 city maps, city and county area maps across the country that use the color-coded system. And so green zones were considered to be best and stable zones for making loans. So banks could comfortably make loans in these particular areas and give high quality loans, and this would be areas. But most of these places were places where there was restrictive deed covenants that excluded blacks. Blacks weren't allowed in those areas because of segregation rules, segregation laws, deed restrictions, and other methods that were in place that blocked black people from having any access to these areas. And these were considered the green zones, the best zones. So they were wide open for banks to loan. They were the least risky areas. And then there was what was called the blue zones, and those were considered still the desirable areas, and blacks were generally excluded from those areas. But this was more poor YT folk. And then there was the yellow areas, and it was called definitely declining. And these areas may include places where there was some intermixing with black and YT people or black and other people. And so you had some other mixed groups in the neighborhood, and this was considered to be damaging to property values. And so this was considered a much higher risk area, the yellow areas. And then there was what was called the red zones. And these red zones were zip codes and areas where there were primarily blacks lived, and also mixed race, black and other mixed race. So these were red areas, and these red areas were considered hazardous neighborhoods, and banks generally would not lend money in those regions. And this is why it was called, because they were marked red on this maps, this called redlining. So these communities were redlined. So you had black people who would put money in the bank, make deposits, have savings accounts, and do their business and transactions through the bank, but they couldn't get a loan from the bank. They couldn't get a loan to start a business. They couldn't get a loan to buy a house. They couldn't get a loan pretty much to do anything, except for maybe some consumer spending. If they were going to use the money to go downtown and buy something from, Sears or the department store or another YT institution, they could get a consumer loan. and usually at subprime rates to pay a much higher interest rate. And so, in terms of looking at and understanding what was happening, this housing market developed that basically excluded black people. It deterred black home ownership, and it created a condition where it made it almost impossible for blacks to get access to the resources to buy a home. And then, in addition to segregation laws and all those things in terms of deed covenant restrictions that said, well, you can't, a black person can't buy this house. It says it in the deed restriction. When they built the house, it excluded being able to sell it to any black people. So that black people couldn't move into a particular neighborhood. All the houses would have a deed restriction that was put in there by the developer. And this was considered legal at the time because of Jim Crow segregation laws made segregation legal. And so in terms of looking at these restrictive covenants, even people who had blacks who had been in the military were denied access to genuine opportunities for home ownership in opportunities to build the kind of equity that's associated with home ownership to stabilize their family. And they were, in most cases, forced to live in these zones that were redlined that usually were properties that were owned by YT people, absentee landlords, who barely kept the property up or barely fixed the property. They just drained money out of the properties. And black people were forced to live in these kind of conditions and rental conditions. And in terms of a few black people may have bought homes in those areas and try to fix them up, even though their property value was affected and all of that because of the surrounding type of conditions. So there was a bunch of factors that were put in place that damaged black people's ability to own homes under these regimes of laws that were put in place designed to suppress and exploit black people because they were able to extract money out of the black community and exploit the black community. But at the same time, the black community, its ability to make any genuine, tangible progress and build equity, it was restricted by law. And so this is when we talk about institutional racism, this is what we're talking about. This is what was put in place. So what we can see, though, is that by 1940, about 22.8% of black Americans own their home. And then so as a result of the New Deal and some of the other things that were put in place, eventually President Truman actually implemented a program to desegregate the United States Armed Services and also implement policies that would allow black folk to get access to home ownership. So at first there was just special little neighborhoods built that just were targeting black GIs. And so there was programs, and usually it was a YT developer that was going to do that, make a ton of money. So it still benefited YT people. But in terms of looking at this situation, by 1950, about 35% black home ownership increased to about 35%. By 1960, it increased to about 38%. By 1970, it had increased to about 42%. And by 1980, it had increased to about 43.8%. And so by 2000, it peaked at 46%. And so after this, there was the subprime mortgage lending crisis. What happened is Republicans had got in, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and you had a relaxing of policies in terms of regulation, in terms of the housing market. And as a consequence, there was what was called subprime lending. And what happened is, like, for example, you have a person who really couldn't afford to buy the house because they didn't have the regular income, but they could buy the house because there was a glut of housing in the market because they allowed a bunch of people just build houses. Developers could build houses, but then they really couldn't sell them. So what they did was they would make the house available. A person could buy the house. They would pay a lower amount that they could afford to pay. They live in the house for a few years, and then a balloon payment will become due. and they couldn't afford the balloon payment, so they would lose the house. And what happened is it created a mortgage crisis. And as a result of this mortgage crisis that took place in 2007, the entire U.S. economy collapsed, and it had a global ripple impact throughout the world. This was a subprime mortgage crisis. And so we see this, went under. And of course, then President Obama came in and he worked diligently to try to revive the economy that had been crashed by Republicans. And so by 2010, after this during this 10-year period of time, there was a major slump in black home ownership because of the subprime mortgage crisis. And so by 2010, it was only about 41.8% of blacks owned their homes, whereas it had been as high as 46% in 2000. So it was a decline. But then after that, it went back up. It started going back up, and by 2020, it had reached about 43.4%. And so what we see is, if we look at this home ownership rate and progress, what we can see is that in recent times, even though it's been up and down, the number have fluctuated between up to 46 down to 43, and some say it's back up to close to 47% now. When you look at the actual data on home ownership and then compare it to 1910 or 1920, when it was 22.3%, you see that there has been major progress in black home ownership. And what was significant about this? It occurred because of policies put in place by Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by policies that were put in place by Democratic President Harry Truman, by the Great Society program by Democratic President Lyndon Johnson, and policies that were put in place along the way that were Democratic-sponsored programs like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968. And so we can see this tangible progress over a period of time. And we see that the black community was organized and voted in a consolidated bloc, for the most part, to support these policies and support this regime of progress, to put and implement these policies that would bring about an opportunity for black people to own homes, to build businesses, and do things that were significant in terms of making tangible progress in America. And so a lot more progress is needed, but these things that happened, the progress that was made, it would not have been made under the prior policies, because the prior policies actually resulted in the destruction of the black community, the denigration of the black community. And so segregation policies and all those things actually had a deleterious impact upon the black community and stifled black progress. And so in terms of it's I think important to be able to really fully understand this whole situation, and recognize some of the things in terms of the housing problem, the housing crisis situation, because we're still in somewhat of a housing crisis. Because, for example, still the vast majority of black people, well over 50%, live in rental housing. And most of the time, when you look at 20% of the black population or more living below poverty, we generally will live in homes that were built prior to 1986. And if you look at, like, for example, prior to 1978, there was a problem with lead paint and lead dust. And homes built before 1986 also had the added problem that they had lead in their water lines that were built inside of the house. They used copper and solder with lead to solder the pipes. In addition to that, the water systems coming from the water treatment plant into neighborhoods, generally these older systems had all types of lead connectors and lead components within the water system, and resulted in high levels of lead in the drinking water. And black families have been miseducated about, and also have not had the means, because many communities there are some communities that YT communities, they provided filters so that you could filter it out. But most of these black communities, there was never any effort. And as a result of that, you have black children who have lead in their blood, in terms of blood tests show them having lead levels that are 5 times higher than the average YT child. In addition to that, because like for example, your diet, like usually you get iron and calcium, you get certain minerals from your diet. But if you have a poor quality diet, you are more likely to absorb more lead because your body will use the lead as a replacement for the iron and calcium, and it is destructive to your body. It causes brain damage and everything else. And so what's happening is you find that black children are disproportionately impacted by lead poisoning, in essence. So you got black children suffering lead poisoning, and it's impacting them in terms of school and education and being able to have a successful career and making their progress. And so because they are subjected to environmental contaminants. In addition to that, there are toxic waste dumps and uses of things like formaldehyde and various different types of chemicals that are destructive to the human body. They're used near black communities. They impact the air and the air quality and drinking water in many black communities all around the country. And so black people are disproportionately exposed to toxic chemicals and also many water treatment areas, especially where there's a large black population, they're substandard. They don't use the latest technology. They don't have the best filtration systems, and the systems are older with lead components. And so all of these are part of the issues that impact on housing. And so it's very important. So like when you look at you're building a house, well, where are you going to build a house? You're going to build a house if you want somebody to buy it, and then they're going to pay a lot of money for the house. Typically, they're not going to buy a house if they know that the water treatment plant is pumping lead to them into the house. They just simply not, they'll find someplace else to buy the house. If there are chemical contaminants, they're going to impact their neighborhood. They're not going to buy it. They're going to shop and go somewhere else. And so what's happening is that these things are disproportionately impacting the black community. And so in addition to some of these things, you also have, for example, where you have high poverty communities, you have high unemployment amongst youth, you have a lack of programs and opportunities for youth. And so you end up having street gangs, you have police racial profiling, you have police violence, you have a drug and crime culture develops, and all these things are resulted that are residual impacts from living in poverty, being racially impacted, being excluded on the basis of race. So when we look at racism, racism has an extremely deleterious effect upon the society in general and black people in particular. And so this housing issue and understanding systemic racism in housing, we can go back and kind of break it apart and look at the components of it and look at how black people are affected, and also how this extracts wealth from the black community, because blacks, in terms of the income and money they get, it just goes out and benefits other people, and they don't build any equity in the house. They don't build any stability that benefits them and builds their community up and enables them to be able to have the equity to buy businesses, to deal with catastrophic medical expenses, or to be able to send their kids to college. And so with the lack of these things in place, what this does is it becomes destructive overall to the black community. So this is the nature of systemic racism that exists, and it has its roots. We can go back and see its origin and watch how it unfolded. And people that now deny that it exists got their head in the sand, because they're not looking at the reality of how it came into being and what continues to happen today. Because the black community is still subjected to predatory lending. They're still subjected to all these things. And you also have the vast majority of black people that are not homeowners. And it's a systematic effort that has created this condition. And even though there has been progress made, the progress is insufficient, not to create any equity or establish any type of equity. So there's still a need for remedial measures. But at this time, there's an effort to dismantle that. There's an overt and outright effort to dismantle Black progress in terms of housing. And this is just simply a fact in terms of looking at it and being able to look at the things that are happening and recognizing that that's what's occurring, And so, because when you eliminate 350,000 jobs of Black women, you're affecting the housing market. You're affecting Black home ownership, among many other things. So, in terms of looking at this, let's now turn to education for just a second here, and look at the fact that after the Civil War, if you go and look at the records of state legislatures, particularly in the South, you had Black preachers and Black leaders actually went before the legislature and asked for segregated schools. And the reason they asked for segregated schools, they said, because, well, Black people, we've been in slavery, we've been through all these things, and we need the opportunity to be able to educate our own folks, and we need to be able to develop, because we're not ready to move in and be in integrated schools. Of course, they didn't want integrated schools, so they went along with it. It was the easiest political out. But what happened is Blacks started to make rapid progress. There was a proliferation of HBCUs, easiest political out. But what happened is Blacks started to make rapid progress. There was a proliferation of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. And Black people began to make substantial progress in terms of building, in terms of education, building communities, building schools. And you also had Black towns and communities develop that had the tax base to be able to fund a quality school. So Black people's schools were developing, they were building communities. But what happened is during this period, there were mob attacks from YT mobs, often led by the local sheriff and law enforcement officials. They would come in and burn down Black towns. They flooded Black towns. They subjected Black people to terrorism. Where Black people may have gone to vote, and it was a majority of the Black people there voted, they would come and take the ballot box and set it on fire so that the votes couldn't be counted. They had poll taxes. They had literacy tests. They used all kinds of methods to systematically eliminate any Black political power. And so by 1901, there were no Blacks in Congress, where there had been record numbers immediately after the Civil War, because the majority of the population in like Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina were Black people. And so in many of the other southern states had, if they didn't have a majority, they had close to a majority in terms of Black population and were entitled to representation in Congress. And so they had some representation immediately afterward, but there was an effort done by that K organization and other YT supremacy groups to suppress that progress. And as a consequence of that, Black people found themselves in a situation where under Jim Crow segregation, they came under the mercy of the YT population in terms of schools. So what happened was you had Black schools that were segregated by law, that didn't have books, couldn't afford to hire quality teachers, could not afford basic things in terms of, you had holes in the roof, a potbelly stove. You had Black children that had to walk 5-6 miles to go to school one way. And so this is the kind of conditions that existed in the Black community. And the YT community built schools near the white homes. They had school buses to pick the kids up and take the kids to school. And so, Black kids would be walking 5 miles to school, and the YT kids would ride by on the school bus on the way to their new built and high quality school with books and teachers and all that, and splash the mud on them while they're walking on their way to a rundown one-room schoolhouse. And so that's the kind of condition and disparity that existed under Jim Crow segregation. And even though black people participated and contributed to the overall community, their resources were not allocated in such a way where it was equitable and that they were able to get real benefits. They were excluded and marginalized. And everything that they did was designed to benefit the YT society. That became the system that was in place and had been a long-standing system that actually continued into the 1900s. But by the 1930s and 40s, black people began to get fed up with it, and they began to try to take some action. So in around 1940, Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the dean of the School of Law at Howard University, he had developed a whole group of young civil rights lawyers, primarily black, some other ethnic groups as well. But he developed these and trained people to become civil rights lawyers. And what happened is Thurgood Marshall, one of his top students, organized the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and began a series of legal cases to attack segregation in public education. And initially, to try to get resources for many black schools that were denied resources. So if you look at what happened during this particular period of time, I think it's very significant because we have some people that promote misinformation. And like, for example, there were two leading schools in the black community. And one of those schools was called Dunbar High School. And Dunbar High School was located in Washington, D.C. And people like Charles Hamilton Houston graduated from it. Many prominent black people were educated there. But you had people who were brought there, came from all over the country just to go to that school, those who could afford to come. So it was an elite black prestigious school. But it was one school. In terms of, in addition, there was another school called Booker T. Washington High School located in Atlanta, Georgia. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, graduated from there. So you had only a handful of elite, prestigious, high-quality schools across the country that black people could attend, and particularly black high schools. And so the vast majority of black people went to these shantytown looking schools, the rundown single room schoolhouse, and they were not able to get a quality education. This was completely unacceptable. But you have people who point to, well, under segregation, you had Dunbar and you had Booker T. Washington, but that served less than 1% of black students, less than 1%. So the other 99+% of black people had to go to school in poverty conditions and in rundown schools, schools that didn't have books or materials or teachers. And that's the condition that existed. So when we talk about, let's go back to segregation, you don't have a real concept of what segregation was. You know, you get this false image that's promoted by some black conservatives and people that are anti-black, and they'll say, oh, okay, well, Dunbar High School and Booker T. Washington, and see, you did well, you know, under those schools, and things were better. We were better off. The reality of it is that maybe less than 1% of black people did well in those schools, but those schools weren't available to the vast majority of black people throughout the country. And so the vast majority of black people did not have high quality schools. And so that becomes the real issue in terms of looking at education. So the foundation of education, we can look at it and we can see how the system unfolded in such a way that after school desegregation was ordered by the U.S. Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education, there was a YT resistance, a backlash. The YT people refused to allow blacks in their schools. Sometimes they blocked the door. They even had the governor block the door to say, oh, we're not going to follow that order. We're not going to allow our schools to be integrated. We don't want to go to school with the black people. And this became part of the condition that existed in the country. And as a consequence of this system that was in place, what you had was you began to get a major academic achievement gap because a number of other things took place with desegregation. Most black teachers were fired and had to go into other careers because white people didn't want black teachers teaching their children. And so there was internal politics. There was a lot of local situations. There were multiple other cases that made it to the Supreme Court, like Swain case in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the Greenberg case. And a host of cases made it back to the Supreme Court. Why? Because of the resistance against desegregation orders. In places like, for example, Prince Edward County, I think Virginia, what they did was they just simply refused, and rather than desegregate, what they did was they just closed down the entire school system and took public funding and gave it to YT churches and held the churches or held school for YT children in the churches and gave nothing to the black community. And so what happened is black children in that particular place, they were more than a year without even being able to go to school because there was no school to go to. And so in terms of, because they shut it down in refusing to integrate the schools. And so in terms of, and of course that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, made forced change or whatever. But the point of the matter is that the level of resistance, many people don't really understand how deep the level of resistance was and the kinds of things and tactics that were used in order to block black children from being able to get access to education, including resegregating black children in the public school system. There actually was very significant abuse of black children, both psychologically and otherwise, in terms of curriculums that promoted white supremacy, curriculums that did not reflect the black experience or black history or black culture, that was a monocultural system that in essence taught a subtle form of white supremacy. And this was so common throughout the country and is part of the system of institutional racism that occurred. And then ultimately what happened is that they adopted laws to establish charter schools. And you had YT flight to private schools because they didn't want to go to school with black children. And then because they really couldn't afford it, they came up with a system to find a way to fund suburban YT schools. So they came up with charter school laws that created a legal fiction to enable them to establish a separate kind of public school called a charter school. And so most of these charter schools became disproportionately YT majority schools and became a way to resegregate in some communities. But there were also some black charter schools that developed. But what happened is there's been, if you look across the country, there's been a systematic attack on these black charter schools unless they are part of some charter school network that's a business enterprise that's reaping substantial financial rewards for YT business owners who are funding YT politicians. And this is just the reality that's going on. And when we look in the midst of all of this, black children are still having a 20 to 40 point academic achievement gap in reading, math, and science. They're graduating high school and can't read. They find themselves in a situation where their SAT scores are between 850 and 950. And the average state university, the best state university in most states, require anywhere between 1050 and 1100 as a minimum to get access to the college. So the average black student graduating from high school in the United States doesn't qualify for admission to their regular state university, let alone qualifying for schools that have a 13, 14, or 1500 requirement for a SAT score. So schools like Harvard or Yale or Princeton or MIT or Tufts or Caltech, or black people are almost completely excluded from these. So it's very rare, anomalous for black people to get in any of these schools. And this is why there's such a low percentage of population in some of the most elite, prestigious, high quality schools in the country. These schools are access into the system, to the economic system, and to, and not having access systematically excludes and blocks black people out of the major hierarchy of power in the United States. So this is part of systemic racism that's in play. And so it's very important for us to recognize now that what they're doing, they're moving to a system of vouchers so that private YT schools can get government funding. And so, you have a whole shift in terms of the way that education is being delivered. And black folk in general, we're not producing schools. We're not organizing charter schools. We're not organizing private schools. We are way behind. We leave to others to educate our children. We don't have any solid curriculum in place that deals with the issue of black identity, that deals with the issue of black personal and self-development. And what's happening is we are losing out. We have children that grow up and they actually end up working for the other side. They work against the interests of black community because they have no solid black identity. They don't even know what happened or how things came to be. They're so out of touch with reality that they work against their own interests, against the interests of their own community and their own families, because of an identity crisis. And then that's being exacerbated now through social media that's promoting all kinds of misinformation to attack black identity. So, in terms of looking at education, there are so many other things I could talk about that are part of the regime of institutional racism that's occurring in the public education system. I'll mention one more. And that is, like, for example, Ebonics. Many black children come to school. They actually don't speak standard English. They grew up in families that spoke Ebonics, a form of dialect that is, in many cases, it is uses the syntax and grammar of African languages that are part of their African heritage. And so in terms of looking at and understanding the history and recognizing what is going on in the black community, most black teachers under black school systems recognize this issue, and they would address this issue of helping black children learn standard English and transition out of Ebonics, so that they recognize Ebonics as a legitimate language. And instead of ostracizing kids for speaking it, they just taught kids standard English. Today, they'll ostracize black kids because they speak Ebonics and make them feel bad about themselves and make them feel ignorant. And this is a problem. And you have a system now where they will fund English language learner projects under Title III, but they won't recognize Ebonics as a language in terms of so that it becomes black children are actually having English as a second language in reality, but they are not afforded the services and support to help them become successful in school. Instead, their personal identity is attacked, and it causes them to have self-image problems, causes them to withdraw from public school, etc. And then if you look at also many black children, they come to school in kindergarten, they are developmentally behind because there's a series of developmental milestones that black children and that all children should learn that help them become ready and capable once they get to kindergarten. But black children often come to school and they haven't reached these developmental milestones because they didn't have access to the support and resources to help them develop these regimes of skills that they needed. And so when they get to school, they're already behind, and there's no system in place in general to help them systematically improve. And so, and to become equitable and come and catch up with everyone else. So by the time they reach the third or fourth grade, they're so far behind, they're unlikely to ever catch up. And so what happens is they look at the cut scores or the test scores, the reading scores, and you can look at the reading scores in fourth grade and and you can estimate the number of prison beds you're going to need because you have people that are not have this kind of skills to cope with and deal with the real world and be able to deal with the real responsibilities, because they don't have the ability to think and reason through things in the language skills in order to deal with things in the society. And so this is a problem. This is all part of systemic racism that exists in America. And all these things are things that can be addressed. There are things that we have to organize and address, that we have to do in order to make the changes that are necessary. And so in terms of looking at this and being able to work this through, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. I want to turn to business and talk about business. And I want to talk about a couple of things related to business. I think that are very, very important. Like, for example, today, there are multiple Black-owned stock exchanges across the African continent. There's also a continent-wide exchange associated with the African Union. But in the United States, there's a couple of seats held on the New York Stock Exchange by a few Black wealthy firms or whatever, but there's no exchange. There's no Black stock exchange. Now, there's some efforts, some people talking about it, but there is none right now. And so in terms of looking at what's happening in participation in terms of public corporations in dealing in that level of business, the Black community is almost completely outsiders when it comes to that. So, when we look at this whole system as it evolved and developed, the whole system of capital developed on the backs of Black people doing slavery. So you look at, like, the Federal Reserve has about $8.6 trillion. You look at the companies involved, and they're the successors of interest in entities that they made their capital on slavery. You look at, like, for example, Wells Fargo and some of the banks and institutions that they're the successor and interest of, that their whole foundation was built on slavery, and being able to take out mortgages on slaves. They owned slaves. That some of their predecessor companies that they took as collateral of foreclosure on loans, and you had a whole system in place that was all built on racism. And as a consequence of it, the major capital, for example, the $4 trillion in capital, or $3 trillion in capital now that they possess, its foundation is slavery. And we can go through, we can look at J.P. Morgan, Chase, we can look at just a host of major companies that have trillions of dollars in assets, and see the foundational source of these assets, and see that the foundation of American business and the structure of the American business infrastructure that have made America powerful and strong is all built on slavery of Black folk and the exploitation and discrimination against Black people that included Jim Crow segregation, and is continually maintained through institutional racism. And so it's important to be able to look at it and understand the flows of resources out of the Black community to the benefit of YT society. But this brings me to, I want to talk about, for example, Madam C.J. Walker. She came on the scene. She developed their hair care products. She started a direct sales program and employed a bunch of Black women, and sold her products, and she did well, became a Black millionaire. I want to talk about someone who came after her, and that is Samuel B. Fuller, S.B. Fuller. And he lived from about 1905 to about, from about 1905. And then he developed Fuller Products Company. He did door-to-door sales, very similar to the Madam C.J. Walker model. And he became a multimillionaire as a Black person, very successful Black business. He dealt with cosmetics, hair care products, and he purchased a YT-owned company in about 1947 that was in trouble. And he bought the company and made that company successful and survive. But they didn't know that it was owned by a Black man. And so his ownership was hidden. And they owned this company called Boyer International Cosmetics. And it was purchased in 1947, and they actually used something called the Jean Nadel cosmetics, and they used something called HA hair arranger systems. These were very popular. They were in drugstores all across the South. It was a very popular product with YT people. And then it was discovered that this was owned by a black man. And so the YT citizens councils that opposed the civil rights movement during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they actually organized a boycott of these products and forced these products to be taken from the shelf so that white YT drugstores and grocery stores, they wouldn't sell these products because it was a black-owned company. And so as a consequence of this, S.B. Fuller, about 60% of the revenue now of his business was impacted because of this boycott that was conducted by the YT Citizens Council. So they, in essence, worked to try to run him out of business and destroy him. And they were very successful and forced him into a situation where ultimately a Republican administration came in and they brought charges against him, said that he sold promissory notes without registering with the Securities Exchange Commission. And they took him through a whole bunch of legal battles and process, and they tried to destroy his company. And primarily they did it because he was black. And then there was also controversy around some of the things that he said that, he, created some enemies in the black community because he felt that, black people should be more self-sufficient and all those kinds of things. But what ended up happening is that his company went into bankruptcy. And then, of course, Joe Dudley came in and acquired some of the assets that were remaining and tried to preserve his legacy. But the fact of the matter is that this is a clear and tangible example of the black community in terms of business, where you have black businessmen who are moving forward and who seem to be doing very well. And then because of racism, they are attacked and systematically his company was ultimately destroyed primarily because of the existence of racism. And so this is very significant in terms of understanding the reality. And you see people like, for example, Reginald Lewis became the first black billionaire. And Reginald Lewis, one of the things that he talks about in his book called Why Should YT Guys Have All the Fun? He wrote about his experience in business. And one of the things is he had done a leveraged buyout of a company called Caribbean Basin. He actually created a company called Caribbean Basin Broadcasting Company, and he purchased a bunch of radio stations throughout the Caribbean and the southern part of the United States, and then he ended up selling that business. And he didn't make a lot of money off of it, but he did well and he learned a lot from it. And so his next project was the acquisition of McCall Patterns that made sewing patterns. And what he did was he was going to acquire the company, he was going to add a greeting card business to it and do some things to enhance its value and then resell it. So when he went to try to purchase it, no one would give him a deal. He couldn't get a deal with multiple companies. And then when he tried to do McCall, what he did was, because he couldn't get a deal with many other projects he tried, he said he used a little guile. And what he did was, instead of coming in and presenting himself as wanting to buy this property, he came in because he was a lawyer and presented himself saying, okay, I represent a client. And most of the owners, the YT owners, automatically assumed that it was a YT client. But it was actually a corporation that he set up, that he owned, and he was the client, or he was the client, or the company was his client that he owned, but he didn't tell him that. And so what he did was he was able to buy McCall Patterns, and then he was able to implement his plan, and he sold it and profited about $70 million. And that he became a legendary businessman at that point. And then he ultimately acquired the international food conglomerate through a leveraged buyout, Beatrice International Foods, and established what was called TLC Beatrice International. And so in terms of looking at how racism impacted his ability to operate. Now, this was a man who had a Harvard law degree, very educated, had a lot of experience in business. He worked developing business plans for the Minority Business Development Agency. If you look at his experience and then see what he had to go through and what racism was like in America, you see that he had many challenges, but the fact of the matter is, think of those business people who come in who don't have a Harvard law degree, who don't have the means and ability that he had. And so you look at what's happening, and then you can see why. When you look in the black community, what you'll find is that the population of blacks, it's about 14.4%. But blacks own about 2.7% of businesses in America. So we are extremely underrepresented in terms of business ownership. And so we have a lot of work to do. And there are systemic barriers that have been in place to block us from being able to become involved in any significant type of businesses. And if you go around looking in certain black communities, all the liquor stores are owned by who? By foreigners. Most of the little grocery stores or corner stores are owned by foreigners. You have foreigners, people that come in this country, they actually set up businesses in the black community, or they acquire businesses in the black community. And they basically suck the resources out of the black community, and then they move on. And they pass it down in their families. But the black community is just simply consumers. And the black community isn't benefiting from those stores, and those businesses take the money out of the black community. They don't put anything back in it. And so it's important to be able to look at and understand where we are and recognize that this current administration has been attempting to eliminate the Minority Business Development Agency. They have been taking action to try to dismantle and destroy the opportunities of black people to participate in business. They've eliminated anti-discrimination clauses in federal government contracts. And this is something that's extremely significant, because what it's doing is giving a green light to YT businesses, larger YT businesses, say, look, you don't have to hire any black people. You don't have to do anything with black people. And this is the conditions that are being created right now that are designed to set back black progress. Also want to mention something like, a lot of people will talk about Claude Anderson, and Claude Anderson wrote the book Pyronomics, and he gives lectures and all those things, and I've studied all of this, his writings and listened to his lectures. But one of the things that really troubled me that Mr. Anderson talks about, he talks about the bus company, that they had a bus company in Durham, and how the bus company had all these buses and they could done all these things or whatever. But Martin Luther King does a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, and his thing was, well, instead of trying to integrate the buses, the YT folk, we need to do our own bus companies. Well, you had the opportunity to, and you didn't do it. You said you people had all these buses in Durham or whatever, but you didn't expand it. You didn't build the business outward where it actually benefited the black community. So the vast majority of the black community was in places like Montgomery, Alabama, where they had to sit on the back of the bus because they didn't own the bus company. They were forced under segregation laws. So it was bigger than just the buses. It was the segregation laws, because not only was the bus affected, but the local grocery store, the restaurant, the public park, everything was impacted by these segregation laws. And what they did, they were challenging the segregation laws. So what's happening is we got a lot of young black people will listen to some of the stuff that he's saying, and they completely get confused because they don't really understand what the full implications are. And they get out of touch with reality because they're being given misinformation, because in reality, 2% of buses could have been owned by blacks during that time. But as far as the black community being able to access bus transportation to go to work every day or do things that they had to do every day, they had to use the public transportation systems that were in place. It'd been great if blacks could own those, but that wasn't the reality. The reality is these were public systems in place. that worked on public roads, that worked, that were involved in a public system, and they had a legal right to ride on the bus without discrimination. And that's what the real issue was there. And we should never, ever forget that and get confused and think that, well, somehow segregation was better and we had the opportunity under segregation, because in reality, you didn't. That's just misinformation that's being promoted, and people will take things like Claude Anderson's statement and they will distort it and further keep distorting it to keep presenting misinformation. And they're becoming experts at that now, especially with social media, with AI, with the internet. And what's happening is we are being subjected to a disinformation campaign that is designed to throw us off, to confuse us, and to make us really ignorant about the reality that that's going on, and it thwarts our chances of success. I also want to mention something about the black church and the black mosque. If you look at the black church, the black church started out in the beginning when after slavery, where there was usually a mutual aid society associated with the black church. The black church was involved in not where the preacher was just trying to hustle some money and the preacher become rich and live a high on the hog kind of lifestyle, while the parishioners suffer in that sense. It wasn't like that then. Then it was a mutual aid society. It was about service. It was about building community. It was about educating children. It was about doing those things to build community and engage in community development. And so this was the beginning of the church. And so the Reverend Floyd Flake, who was a Congressman Floyd Flake, he was also a pastor of, I think either Abyssinia Baptist Church or one of the major black churches, I think in Harlem. And, they had like 10,000 members or whatever, and they built a mega church because what they were doing was the church was involved just like the Vatican. The Vatican actually had a Vatican bank. They had all kinds of programs where, they actually supported the development of communities all over the world, so that they were heavily financed in all kinds of industries and all of that. And so what Floyd Flake did was try to go around and teach black preachers how to build what's called the mega church. And the mega church, not MAGA church, mega, M-E-G-A, not M-A-G-A, but mega, M-E-G-A, large church. And what he tried to do was teach them how to structure it in such a way where they could retain their tax-exempt status as a church, engage in businesses in an arm's length way so that their income was passive to the church. So to create an investment arm and to be able to then build businesses that come out of this system that they set up, so that, they could build houses and build neighborhoods for church members, so that they could support businesses within those communities, so that they could provide a system in place that built an economic infrastructure and harness the resources that flow in the black community so that it circulates multiple times in the black community before it goes out, if it ever goes out, to build up the economic foundation of the black community. And these were programs that were put in place in efforts to do this. Now, of course, many black preachers, just simply didn't have the skill set for it, unless they had other members that came in and supported and organized it and trustee councils and groups and people that, to help them implement it. And there's some that have done it, and some marginally, some have done it very successfully. But the point of the matter is that when we look at the system that goes on, that every Sunday is the most segregated time in the country, because the YT people go to the YT church, the black people go to the black church, and you have some integrated churches, and maybe a few more than you had before, but in reality, it is a highly segregated system. And what is happening, though, in religion is we have right now what's called the Christian right or evangelical movement. And if you go back and trace their history, they actually grew out of the YT Citizens Councils that was involved in trying to destroy S.B. Fuller. They, in essence, believed in a YT Jesus. The Bible, actually, if you look at the Bible and study the Bible is unambiguous about Jesus' looks. That it says he has hair as a lamb wool, kinky hair, black folk hair, and his feet were as brass burnt in an oven, black skin with a brownish tinge, a dark-skinned black man. And this is the image of Jesus that the Bible gives, and it's unambiguous. It's unmistakable if you actually read it. But they'll say, oh, well, that's just symbolic, or they'll come up with a reason to rationalize it away. And people like Billy Graham would say things like, well, Jesus wasn't black and he wasn't white. He was he would be an olive skin like the Middle Easterners today or whatever. That's just simply not true. You know, the Levant, the area where Israel's located, where Jerusalem is located, all of that was part of Africa during that period of time. Africa, it's still on the African tectonic plate. They built the Suez Canal and then separated and called it the Middle East. But at one point, it was part of the continent of Africa, and it's still part of the African tectonic plate today. And so, in terms of just the fact that it was invaded by other people and other people came in and they took it over and now the people look different or whatever, the fact of the matter is that the Bible tells us what Jesus looked like. And so the thing is, now you have people who they don't believe in the real Jesus. Let me say that again. They don't believe in the real Jesus. They believe in a YT Jesus that they created during the Middle Ages. This Michelangelo's cousin, when he painted the Holy Family in the Sistine Chapel, and he used his uncle's wife and their son as the model. And so when we began to really look at it and understand this is why there's scripture that says that in that day, many will cry, Lord, Lord, and he'll say, well, get away from me. I never knew you, you workers of iniquity. And, you know, and there's people will rely on this verse called John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, and that whoever should believe it, whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And you listen closely to preachers, especially the YT preachers, they'll get up and they'll say, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, and whosoever believeth him shall not perish but have everlasting life. They say shall not, but the actual text says should not. So there's no guarantee. And they're teaching people that they are guaranteed that once you're saved, you come in, you join our church, and you pay your tithes, and you're saved. And now that you're saved, that you're going to heaven. You're promised to go to heaven. So you can sin and do whatever the hell you want to. It don't matter because you've already been, you know. But the scripture says, he that endures to the end, the same shall be saved. So it's a false doctrine. It's a whole false narrative. The Charlie Kirk and all these people are instruments of the devil. They don't know nothing about God. They're fakes. They worship a YT Jesus, a fake Jesus. And they persecute the real people of Jesus. Because every time you discriminate against an immigrant and try to have him thrown in alligator Alcatraz or take him and deport him, when he's suffering, he came here because he was suffering and in need. He came here for help. He came here for compassion. And you take him and lock him up and mistreat him and put him in a cage and do all these things. How do you think God looks at you? What do you think is going to happen to you ultimately? What do you think is going to happen to you? Think about it. If there is a just God, you may think there is none and it's all fake. But if there's a just God, you can be guaranteed you're going to have some trouble, and it's coming soon. And you look at what's happening, and you see right now that what's happening is they're trying to erode the rights of black people once again. You're seeing the decline in black home ownership. You're seeing the rise in black unemployment. You're seeing gerrymandering of election districts and attempts to disenfranchise black people in their right to vote and have representation in the government. There's a systematic effort. There's like 350,000 black women just lost their jobs, let alone the thousands and thousands of more black men. When you look at what is going on and where the scripture talks about, I was hungry and you fed me not. I was sick and you visited me not. You didn't give me any medicine. You didn't comfort me. I was a stranger and you didn't comfort me. Instead, you try to put me in alligator Alcatraz. When you start looking at this, and Jesus says, and they said, well, when did we do that to you, Lord? And he said, well, to the extent that you have not done these things for the least of these, my brethren, you have not done it for me. So get away from me, be gone. There'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's what the scripture says. So in terms of looking at it and understanding it, it's time to repent if you really want to understand it. Because what's happening is you need to repent. You got black folk that have gone through this. There's been no reparations to black people. And you're saying we live in a post-racial society? That racism is over with? And black people are experiencing racism every single day? And you got your institutions, your Supreme Court, the administration, and now the Congress all working in concert to damage the progress of the black community. And so when you take a look at this, you are attacking Jesus. That's who you're attacking. And so in terms of black folk, black folk is looking and saying, well, praise the Lord, but what do you think is going to happen? Because Jesus is coming. Now, you may not understand what that really, really means, but I'm telling you, Jesus is coming and he's going to judge you. And you don't want to be found wanting, because when Jesus comes, the scripture describes what's going to happen. And you pretended that you believe in it, but I don't know. You may have to find out the hard way. But in terms of looking at this whole thing, look at the healthcare industry. So right now, in terms of black people, like 14.7% of the population, but we're only about 5.7% of the doctors. We're about 7.8% of the nurses. We're about 3.8% of the dentists. We're about 2% of psychiatrists. You look at what's happening in the black community, and blacks are underrepresented in the healthcare industry in terms of physicians and nurses and professionals, because we're systematically excluded from the educational opportunities. We are denied education at a younger age or placed in inferior quality educational settings. So it's not preparing us. And so what's happening is we now have these major shortages because we're just not getting access because of systemic racism. In addition to that, we have black folk are disproportionately have access to health care. So we don't have the same access to health care, health insurance, as YT people, and because of systemic racism. And so in terms of looking at the way that this whole system is operating, it's operating on the basis of systemic racism. It is a racist society. And we can look at it and try to analyze it, but if we actually look at the facts, there's really just no denying it. There's no way around it. We can look at it, and most of it's palpable, it's tangible. We can see it, we can touch it, we can feel it. The data is there. You can see it every day. And so, to say we live in a post-racial society, that's a liar. That's somebody who's coming to you and they're lying to you, and while they are attempting to institutionalize racism, while they are attempting to destroy you and damage you and take stuff from you, they're just lying to your face. They're like a con man, lying to your face, using double talk, speaking with a forked tongue, lying to you while they are working to lay you low, to destroy you and take whatever they can take from you. That's what we're dealing with. That's the reality of the experience that exists, and so it's so important for us to really understand what's happening, to be in touch with reality. And for us, I think that the bottom line becomes that we have to recognize that institutional racism continues to exist. And I believe that there are many other people of goodwill of all colors that recognize that institutional racism continues to exist. And they can see, and the reality of it is that you only have a really small group who now has gained power. And they are in a situation now where they are trying to exercise that power and control that power and hold on to power. And the question is how far they will go. What kind of damage can they do? Since they've gotten power, they don't want to let it go. So they're doing everything they can to structure the system in a way to prevent the majority from being able to have control of the system again. And so they've worked systemically to deal with it. They didn't take the proper action that they should have done earlier against them. And so they were allowed to thrive and grow. They tried to overthrow the government. They attacked the Capitol. They've done all kinds of wicked things. And the question is, when will they be judged for it? And I believe that the American people will judge them. And that judgment is going to come very soon, and it's not going to be pretty. And so I pray for everyone that we all are able to understand the reality of where we're at, that we're able to move forward, and that we're able to preserve this society. Because we have millions of people, black and white people, IT people, who have sacrificed their lives in various wars in this country, who have done many things in order to try to preserve a system of democratic society, that have worked to try to implement a vision of a multicultural society that's consistent with the Bible. Because the Bible talks about, when it talks about the kingdom of heaven, it's given an image of a system where it's every nation, tribe, kindred, tongue, and people. It's a multicultural society. It's multi-ethnic, multiracial. It's a fabric of humanity that's working together. That's the kingdom of heaven. That's the kingdom of God. And it's the image of a harmonious society where everyone is working together and working for each other's mutual interests, and who loves each other and all these things. And the vision of it is there are many people that have captured that vision and who are in accord with God and who recognize the need to work together to build such a harmonious society. But then you have another group of people who are a smaller group of people who really are working against the interests of God and working against the interests of the people. And they, in fact, are working on this pipe dream of YT supremacy, of pretending that they're better than other people, of pretending that they know more than other people, of pretending that they're entitled to some type of privileged position above everyone else. And what they're doing is they're willing to do as much damage as possible. If you go back to the Civil War, this same group of people, what they did was they caused the death of over 1 million people because of their selfishness, because of their arrogancy, and their desire to enslave a group of people based on misinformation, lies, and half-truths. And so in terms of understanding reality of where we're at, this is where we are. This is the situation that we're dealing with. And institutional racism is alive and well. It's a tangible reality. You can even trace back how the economic resources are flowing from institutional racism and where it's going. You can identify it very clearly today, just like you could during Jim Crow segregation and just like you could during the period of slavery. So in terms of understanding where we are and recognizing the kinds of challenges that are ahead of us, we have to take the time to really, really recognize where we are in time and space and recognize the challenges that are before us and to not allow ourselves to become part of the problem, but become part of the solution. So I'm going to close with just saying that my goal was to talk about institutional racism, to share some information, to bring home the reality that it still exists and is alive and well today, and is actually being exacerbated and becoming worse. And to recognize the fact of this regime of civil rights that took place during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they were necessary and important to enable the Black community to be able to have an opportunity for equal footing. And many, many groups benefited from these civil rights laws, not just Black people, but women benefited, other minority groups benefited. It benefited everyone, not just Black people. And so the fact of the matter is now this effort to dismantle that system, to try to take us backwards, to destroy what was built, that cannot be tolerated. And we must, as a group of people, whether we are Black, whether we're whitey, whether we are any other ethnic group within this country, we have to take a stand. We have to recognize the reality and the evil nature of what is going on and take a stand against it. God bless you. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you for listening.